here. Welcome to our last book club event of 2021. I can't believe we've done now 12 book talks. So kudos to those who've joined us for a lot of them. I know Pat and Elaine have been here for the majority. So you guys are book club gold members. um, Tonight, we are very excited to have Detroit writer and coach Amy Nielander. She is a picture book author and illustrator, and we'll be talking about her book, Grandma's Hug and the Ladybug Race. Like I said, I'm very excited to have Amy round out our year of book club talks. She has a wonderful presentation for us, and we will have a book giveaway at the end. You must stay on Zoom to win, so don't head out early if you can stick around. Without further ado, Amy, the Zoom screen is all yours.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for spending your evening with me tonight. And Stephanie, I really appreciate your time during this busy season. I know there's lots going on, and I really appreciate you checking in here today. So we are going to get started in the spirit of picture books. I have visuals to look at as well, since picture books are really telling a story with visuals and text. So I thought we could take a look at a presentation that I have for all of you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you give me a thumbs up if you see everything? Okay, perfect, great, super. All right, let me just move this here. Okay. All right, so welcome. Again, thank you for joining us, and it's an honor to be a part of this book club, and I hope you've enjoyed every month's book and author who did their chat. And for tonight, I have a few things that I want to go through. We're going to talk about just the basics of a picture book. What is it? Who is it for? A little bit of the details. We're going to talk about Grandma's Hug, and the nice thing about picture books are they are so short, you can read them pretty quickly. So I have the book available to look at, and so we'll do a read aloud, and then I'll share my inspiration for the story. We'll talk about the Ladybug Race, and I have a few spreads that we can look at for that, and I'll talk about that inspiration, and then I will share some story making tips. So if you're a writer and you've thought about writing a children's picture book, then these will kind of help get you started, things that you might find helpful to make your journey a little smoother. So we'll just go ahead and get started, but first I'll just talk a little bit about me. So I'm a picture book author, illustrator. I write and illustrate stories. I began my picture book journey in 2007. The Ladybug Race is my first book. It's wordless, and it's published by Pomegranatekids out in Oregon. It's a story about compassion, kindness, and teamwork, and we'll talk a little bit about it later. Grandma's Hug is a story about the bond between a grandma and her granddaughter, as well as their goodbye traditions. And it's all wrapped up in a STEM theme. So there's lots of space and a little bit of science in there. My third picture book is called My Name Is Not Ed Tug, and that actually will be released in October of 2022. And that's a story about family, heritage, and standing up for yourself. And it's centered on a boy that has a really long name, and he has a teacher who wants to shorten it when a new student arrives in their classroom. And it's about how he overcomes that obstacle. And it will be published by West Margin Press. So I will share my first attempts at illustrating with you. This is a spread that I did back in 2008 when I was still trying to figure out how to illustrate and do that digitally. So I grew up with a mom who was an extraordinary storyteller. Basic conversations always included suspense and humor. She loved to write as well, and often shared her stories with me while I was growing up. She was quite a visionary too. I was always captivated by her ability to pull a story together really quickly. My mom also had a godchild, and on a few occasions, she would write a story for her birthday as a gift. And the main character was always the godchild. And my mom thought it would be fun for me to illustrate those stories at some point. I didn't do that at that time, but I revisited the idea when we started a family. So I always liked to draw as a kid, and I eventually went to college to be a product designer. After we started our family, I decided to leave my job because I was no longer even designing or using any of my creativity. And I was fortunate enough to be able to stay home and raise our son and daughter. And during that time, I wanted to look for another option for me, another career that gave me more flexibility. So we were always going to the library when my kids were little, and I just treasured my time on the couch with them alongside a giant pile of picture books. And maybe you guys have experienced that too if you have kids. And after seeing how much joy they brought my kids, I just started to question whether or not I could attempt picture book illustrations. I always kind of like to write and I like to draw, and I just was curious, I guess, if I could do it. So that was when I revisited a story my mom wrote for that godchild, and I decided we should try to publish it traditionally. And without doing much research about the process, I kind of jumped in and illustrated the entire picture book. I didn't know how many words a picture book should be, how a dummy should be submitted. That's kind of like a representative of a picture book. And I just focused on completing the story and sending it to publishers. And so this is a spread from that story. And after submitting it to about 20 publishers, do I have you guys on the screen? Okay, sorry about that. We only received a handful of rejections. So we just decided it was time to move on. So during the process of making her picture book, I fell in love with the whole story making phase. I decided to practice illustrating. The only problem, I had nothing to illustrate. So I began writing my own stories so that I could build a portfolio. And this is a story that I did early on. I like to rhyme when I first started writing. I grew up playing an instrument, and I felt like that kind of fell into that category. So I experimented a lot with rhyme. And this is a story that, this is one of the first stories that I created. So my path to publication was definitely not straight. This is what it looked like before my first book was published. It was very bumpy, but it allowed me to come up with new story ideas. So my experiences gave me a different perspective. And if it weren't for them, I wouldn't have come up with the stories I have today. And sometimes, back then when I was starting out, and I would let that be a wall sometimes. I felt like, oh, I've done too many different things. I'm never going to get there, but it was actually those things that kind of shaped my stories. So I'm here to tell you, if you're an aspiring children's book writer, you can get your story published by becoming a student of the industry. Just consume picture books, right? And revise your stories so they're the best they can possibly be, and just share your work with other writers and professionals so that you can get a fresh pair of eyes on them and receive that valuable feedback. And that's what really helped me become a better writer. So what is a picture book? So this is probably a familiar picture book for all of you. A picture book is for kids that are 4 to 8 years old. The word count is usually 500 max. For fiction, you can go over, but it's really subjective. But that's what the rule of thumb is: 500, 1,500 or less for nonfiction. Pages are 32 and sometimes 40 or 48. And Grama's Hug is actually 40 pages. So the purpose of a picture book is to help a child learn and grow by delivering a fun, engaging, and memorable story through text and illustrations. So picture books strengthen visual thinking skills. Looking at illustrations is a great opportunity to ask kids questions about what they think is going on in the story. Picture books introduce new words and concepts to readers. When we read Grandma's Hug, we'll see an example of this in the space fair scene. The main character is working on a robot. And if you were reading this passage to a child, it might lead to a conversation about robots and how they're made. And, you know, you could discover new terms and words that way. Picture books build empathy. So they help children experience different emotions and situations they may not have faced yet. And I'll point this part out as we read the story. So Arthur Levine is the president and editor-in-chief of a publishing house called Levine. I tried to pronounce that. I looked it up probably 10 times to make sure I could say it. I still could be wrong though. So he's also well known for acquiring the Harry Potter series when he was at Scholastic. And he had written an article about picture books, and I just like the way he described them to everybody. So picture books and their older cousin graphic novels are the only forms of published storytelling that give equal narrative weight to the text and the art. And that's so important to remember, because naturally when you're writing, you think to describe the story. But for picture books, you really don't have to go into that much detail because you have the illustrations that are also communicating part of the story to you, and sometimes another story. And that's kind of the fun part when you discover other storylines that are going on because of the illustrations. But that is something that writers, you know, is always important to remember. And a few aspects of a picture book that support the story, unlike other genres, are sound. How do the words sound to a child? Is it a playful tone? Is it an inquisitive tone? Is it a serious tone? The amount of text you have on a page. How long can a child explore the illustration while an adult reads the text? The pacing is important. How does pacing build tension? When you're reading an adult fiction, you don't think, you know, page turns are just, you don't even think about them, but for a picture book, they're essential. They need to support your story. And then page turns, how do they create surprise or comic timing and suspense? So the first sentence of Where the Wild Things Are is a perfect example of equal narrative weight between text and illustrations. I'm not going to share it with you. I'll share the sentence, but I'll describe the illustrations for you. But I won't even read the entire sentence. The first page begins with, the night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind. So if you can imagine, you know, that doesn't give you a lot of information, right? It's not describing what that mischief is, but when you look at the illustrations, it fills in all of those blanks. It shows you what that mischief is. He's hammering a giant nail into the wall. He strung a bunch of tied sheets together to make a curtain, and he's standing on a stack of books. So that's something the illustrator gets to choose. How does he want to tell the rest of the story? How can he or she support the story? And then we have a page turn and another. And so this is another illustration of him causing mischief, but you wouldn't know that by just those two words, right? So that's kind of the fun approach to picture book storytelling, is you really get to play with the page turns, the amount of descriptions, and thinking about the illustrations for your story, even if you're not an illustrator. All right, so now we're gonna hear the inspiration behind the story. The idea for the story landed in 2013. So it was published in 2020. So there was quite a bit of time that went by between first spark and completed book. I was working on other projects at the same time. But when I was walking my daughter up to school one day, the bell rang and kids ran inside. And then I heard a nearby parent yell out, "I'm not leaving without a hug." And that sentence just stopped me and stuck in my head immediately. I don't know why, it just did. And I kept wondering, what would you do if you didn't get that hug? If your child didn't turn back around and you didn't get that hug, what would you do? And after that, it just started making me ask questions, just like that. And I felt like there was a story there. And so I started writing, and there were several drafts. And this is draft number 9. The first draft was really just a list. It wasn't even, text that made any sense. It was kind of how I saw scenes coming across for the reader. And so I just described them. But then I needed words, and I started adding words. And so this is the draft 9 that I wrote. And it was a story about a grandma who always hopes for a hug goodbye from her grandchild when she drops him off at school, but she never gets an inkling of affection. And there's no hug on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And then after feeling frustrated on Friday, which was also hugless, the grandma stays at the school and tries to comfort herself by helping others throughout the day. So she just finds little odd jobs to do and help, just helping. There was a gardener, I think, on the school grounds, and then there was a teacher trying to hang things. So she worked through that by helping others. And when school got out that day, since she was already there, she met her grandchild where she left him, and she gets a hug, hello, not goodbye. So that was kind of the first version of the story. And I decided to take that story to a writing conference and share it at a roundtable critique. And at the time, I didn't have a critique group. It was just my eyes on the story. And I just needed a fresh pair of eyes. I needed to be around other writers who were doing the same thing I was and give me their honest feedback. And so I took the story to the conference, read it at the round table. I think there were 2 round tables, and I did not get the response I had hoped for. There was no change in expression. And I left that conference just scrapping everything. I knew, okay, I need to try again. I'm lacking a connection with the reader. And so I needed to kind of dig a little deeper. So I needed to find the heart of the story. And then in the process of rewriting, a childhood memory was rattled, and it led me in a completely different direction. And the reason that sentence stuck with me was because when I was about 8 years old, my grandfather visited us from Europe. My dad is from Europe, and he came over here in his early 20s. And so my grandparents still lived there, and I can only remember him visiting maybe once or twice. And the day he left, we were running behind, and we arrived at the airport late. When we got there, we didn't even park. We just drove right up to the drop-off area. And he got out, and there was no time for a hug goodbye. And he left exchanging only quick words and a wave. And that was the last time we saw him. That was the last time my father saw him. And he passed away from cancer a few years later. And that lack of closure caused great agony for my dad. And that's why I believe that sentence it stuck with me. That memory, I think, was buried in the back of my mind. I hadn't thought of it for a long time, and still until I started writing. And so I wanted a story about goodbyes being sacred. No matter what the situation is, we should always make time for them, even if that means stopping a spaceship from blasting off. If we can spare ourselves some grief and regret, I think we all might be a little happier. So that's when I started to turn things around. But there were still lots of drafts ahead of me. I kept writing, kept tweaking. It was wordless for a while. And then after I wrote kind of close to the last draft, the blue is when I actually sent it to a publisher who was interested, and they still wanted it to be revised. And so after they acquired the story, we kept on adding text to it because there just wasn't enough for everyone. There was such a long passage of time. Not everyone was following it well with just the illustrations, so we kept on adding text to it. And if you remember when I mentioned the parent who yelled the sentence that inspired the book at the time, we just hovered in the same circles. Her daughter and my daughter were the same age and in the same grade. But we became good friends after that point. And I knew if my story was published one day, I would dedicate it to her. And so she got the first copy, and that's when she discovered the dedication. So that was just a really fun moment for me and for her, and just for, you know, all of us when I share this story, because it's, you never know, you know, what you'll be inspired by and why. But I really truly believe that things stick to us for a certain reason, and until you start digging, you won't find out.